What does it mean when silence carries more weight than song? On the plantations of Louisiana, silence was a weapon as sharp as any blade. It was the silence of bent heads, of chained wrists, of lips pressed tight against the scream that longed to break free. It was also the silence of waiting, an ember buried in ash, biding its time until the right breath of wind set it alight. Caroline had carried such silence all her life. To the mistress who ordered her about with clipped words and sharp hands, she was nothing but another shadow moving through the grand house. To the guests, she was the maid who poured wine without spilling, who stood at the back of the room and seemed to vanish when laughter rose too loud. But behind her lowered eyes she kept count, of insults delivered, of lashings given, of graves dug too early. Each memory was a coal glowing beneath her stillness. Christmas morning came as a day of hymns and bells for the White family. The plantation house filled with pine branches, oranges brought in from town, and ribbons tied around candles. Children ran through the halls in bright garments while the mistress preened in her holiday dress. Laughter spilled across polished floors, but outside, frost lingered over the slave quarters, where bare feet pressed into frozen earth. For the enslaved, Christmas was no day of rest. It was a day of greater service, greater humiliation for the joy of others. Yet this particular morning carried something heavier. The bells that tolled from the chapel down the road seemed to shiver in the air, echoing with a note of warning rather than celebration. The fire in the parlor crackled a little too fiercely, spitting sparks onto the rug as if restless. Caroline moved through the house like smoke itself, seen, unseen, impossible to grasp. Some said her silence was obedience. Others, if they dared whisper it, feared it was something else. For silence, when held long enough, could become flame. And on this Christmas morning of 1852, a fire waited to be born, one that would consume not only walls and flesh, but every illusion of power the mistress believed eternal. Louisiana in winter carried no mercy. The air hung damp and heavy, soaked with the smell of cane stalks cut low, their jagged stumps jutting from the earth like broken teeth. Moss-draped oaks leaned over the fields, their long green veils swaying like mourners' shrouds. Smoke curled from the chimneys of the great house, rising into the pale December sky, carrying with it the scent of roasting meat and pine logs. To those within its walls, it was the perfume of celebration. To those outside, it was the bitter smell of labor, of meals prepared by hands that would never taste them. The plantation house itself stood proud, white columns gleaming even under the gray winter sun. Garlands of holly and pine wound up the staircase, red ribbons tied in elaborate bows, candles glowing faintly in every window. Music seeped faintly from within, a soft tinkling of piano keys warming the grand parlor. Christmas here was spectacle, a display of wealth cloaked in piety. Beyond the manicured lawns and trimmed hedges, the slave quarters crouched low to the ground, a huddle of fragile huts with walls of rough-hewn timber and roofs patched with tar and rags. No wreaths hung on those doors. Smoke from their fires was thin, barely enough to warm the small rooms where families pressed close against the cold. The contrast was cruel, deliberate, as though the plantation itself had been split into two worlds, one of abundance, one of deprivation. The mistress of the house presided over it all, a figure as sharp and glittering as the jewelry strung around her neck. She walked the halls with her Bible in one hand and the keys to the storerooms in the other, reciting verses of charity while striking her servants for imagined slights. Her cruelty was not loud like the overseer's whips, but sharper, more intimate. A misplaced glance, a dish set too late, the faintest hint of hesitation, each became an excuse for punishment. And behind closed doors, her wrath grew harsher, as though unseen cruelty cost her nothing. On this Christmas morning, the air was thick not only with smoke and song, but with something heavier, an oppression that clung to the skin, as if even the trees bent lower beneath it. Caroline moved through the grand house like a shadow that knew its place. She carried herself with quiet dignity, her back straight even when her hands were full of trays, linens, or firewood. To the mistress, she was nothing more than another tool, obedient, silent, useful. To the guests, she was hardly noticed at all, a slip of dark cloth at the edge of their vision, seen only when she poured their wine or bent to collect a fallen ribbon. Her role was that of a housemaid, and that meant proximity to wealth without possession. She scrubbed the silver until it gleamed, yet owned not a single spoon of her own. She polished the mistress's jewelry box but had never touched a trinket inside. She laid the children's Christmas garments across their beds, fine velvet and lace, while her own dress was patched and thin. This closeness to luxury was its own torment. She could see it, breathe it, but never hold it. Yet beneath her outward mask of submission lived something sharper. Caroline's silence was not emptiness, it was calculation. She watched without seeming to watch. Every movement of the mistress, every careless cruelty, every locked door and hidden key, Caroline observed and remembered. She moved softly through the house, yet her mind traced maps of it, where the candles stood, how the curtains caught draught, how quickly fire spread across dry pine garlands. On this Christmas morning, her presence blended into the background of festivities. She knelt at the hearth, feeding the parlor fire until the flames licked the logs hungrily. Her hands lingered there a moment too long, as though she drew not just warmth but strength from the blaze. She glanced at the mistress in her silken dress, her movements precise, eyes narrowed not in fear but in a kind of study. Caroline's obedience was her disguise, her silence her shield. They thought her invisible, but she was the only one who truly saw. The plantation hummed with preparation for the Christmas feast. Wagons rolled in with barrels of cider, baskets of fruit, and hams cured to perfection. Overseers barked orders in the yard but were less vigilant than usual, their attention drawn to their own share of celebration. White guests from neighboring estates arrived in bright carriages, their laughter spilling across the fields. The great house swelled with music, perfume, and candlelight, its windows glowing like a beacon against the winter dusk. Caroline moved among them unseen, carrying platters and polishing glasses, adjusting garlands that brushed against her shoulders. She served without hesitation, but her silence seemed to invite mockery. The mistress, her lips painted crimson, snapped at Caroline for the smallest misstep, a napkin folded imperfectly, a tray set down a breath too late. Clumsy hands, she scoffed loud enough for the guests to laugh, and the children mimicked her, giggling as Caroline steadied herself under their gaze. Their cruelty was casual, practiced, effortless. To the other enslaved, however, Caroline's silence was no longer ordinary. Whispers followed her through the quarters. She was too quiet lately, they murmured, too watchful. Some said she was fading into shadow, touched by something more than human patience. Others dared not speak at all, only glanced after her when she passed, as though afraid her silence might swallow theirs too. While the house prepared for feast and merriment, Caroline prepared something else. In the kitchen, she saved slivers of lard, wrapping them in scraps of cloth tucked beneath her skirts. In the scullery, she gathered splinters of resinous pine, brittle and eager to burn. At the hearth, she pressed embers into small clay dishes, carrying them out under the guise of clearing ash. Each piece was insignificant, invisible. Together, they formed the bones of something greater. The mistress basked in her grandeur, never seeing the stillness in Caroline's eyes. Guests raised glasses, overseers loosened belts, and the sound of fiddles filled the parlor. But beneath the laughter and the hymn-singing, tension coiled tighter, unseen by those who mistook silence for submission. The house glowed with festivity. Caroline's heart glowed with something else, something smoldering, waiting, inevitable. The first sign came as a whisper of flame. A barn door caught fire in the middle of the night, a thin tongue of orange licking up the dry wood. Slaves scrambled with buckets of water, stamping it out before the blaze could spread. By morning, the charred scar on the door stood as a silent omen. The mistress, roused from her sleep, stormed across the yard in her nightdress, accusing everyone of carelessness. "You would burn my property to the ground with your laziness," she hissed, striking a boy who swore he had fastened the lamp. The overseers muttered about drafts, but the mistress's eyes narrowed at the servants, Caroline most of all. Not long after, the kitchen pantry turned sour. Meat spoiled despite the frost, milk clabbered overnight, and bread went moldy before it could be served. Rats appeared in the corners, bold and unafraid, their eyes glowing in the dim candlelight. The mistress slammed her Bible on the table, declaring it the devil's work. Servants were whipped for failing to keep the place clean, though they scrubbed until their hands bled. In the quarters, whispers grew. Some said the fire had been no accident, that spirits had walked beside Caroline that night. They noticed how her silence deepened, how she carried herself as if listening to something no one else could hear. A few grew fearful, keeping their distance. Others lowered their eyes with quiet reverence, as though she bore the weight of something holy or cursed. The mistress, unsettled by what she could not name, lashed out harder. A spilled drop of wine brought the sting of her cane against Caroline's arms. A moment's hesitation in lighting a lamp earned her a slap across the mouth. "Ungrateful creature," the mistress spat, "you will learn obedience or die of it." Caroline stood still through every blow, her face unreadable, her silence a shield the mistress could not shatter. But inside, the fire only spread. Every strike, every accusation, every humiliation was another spark added to the embers she kept hidden. The mistress believed she was breaking Caroline's spirit. In truth, she was feeding the blaze that would one day consume her. The air of festivity had soured into dread. The Christmas season no longer felt blessed. It felt cursed, as though the house itself trembled, waiting for something to come. Caroline had not always been silent. Once, years ago, her voice had carried laughter, lullabies, and the soft hum of work songs. But that was before Louisiana swallowed her whole, before the mistress's hand reached into her life and tore it apart. She had been 19 when they sold her away from her mother and brother, carted from one auction block to another until she landed on this plantation. She carried her first child in her arms, a boy with skin the color of warm earth and eyes like dark glass. He was hers, her single flame against the suffocating night of bondage. For a time, she believed even chains could not smother the tenderness between them. But hunger drives hands into forbidden places. One bitter evening, when rations were gone and his stomach ached, the boy stole a loaf of bread from the mistress's pantry. Caroline begged forgiveness, begged them to punish her instead. But the mistress had stood tall in the parlor, draped in silk and righteousness, her lips curled in satisfaction. "The child must learn," she declared, "or he will grow insolent like his mother." They tied him to the whipping post. Caroline's cries were drowned out by the crack of leather, each lash carving silence into her throat. She was forced to watch, her arms pinned as her son screamed and bled, his small body breaking under punishment meant for grown men. By nightfall, his cries had faded, and by morning he was gone, buried in the earth behind the quarters, a wooden marker already sinking into the mud. That day, Caroline's voice vanished. She learned the cost of pleading, the futility of words. The mistress believed she had silenced her forever, but silence is not death, it is waiting. Her mother's voice returned to her in dreams, a whisper from faraway shores. "Fire is judgment," she had said. "Flame cleanses what cruelty stains. When the lash has done its worst, the fire will do the rest." Those words lingered, buried deep, kindling a secret strength. Now, as Caroline endured the blows of the mistress's cane and the jeers of her children, she carried that inheritance within her. Her silence was not weakness, it was patience. Every insult was another twig added to the pyre, every scar was tinder, and one day, when the moment came, the fire would speak for her. On Christmas Eve, the house filled with the sweet scent of roasted fowl and spiced cider. Garlands wound through the stair banisters, ribbons shimmered in candlelight, and the parlor brimmed with guests wrapped in velvet and fur. They came bearing laughter, songs, and shallow praise for the mistress, who preened before them like a queen in her kingdom. A preacher stood near the hearth, Bible open, voice rich and booming. He spoke of God's blessings, of charity and mercy, and praised the mistress for her godliness and kindness in keeping a household so well ordered. Caroline stood in the corner with her tray of wine cups, her face lowered, her silence perfect. But inside, her contempt coiled sharp as a blade. Kindness. The word was an insult, a desecration. She remembered her boy's broken body, the grave that swallowed him whole. No sermon could cleanse that. Guests clapped, children squealed, and hymns rose into the rafters. Overseers lingered at the edges, trading sly grins as they drank more than their share. The house pulsed with festivity, but Caroline slipped between shadows unseen, her steps measured. She checked the hearth where she had fed the flames earlier, eyes narrowing at the way sparks leapt greedily along the pine logs. In the kitchen, she touched the small bundle hidden away, cloth soaked in fat, resin splinters tucked tight. Everything was ready, waiting. Her stillness did not go unnoticed. One overseer, heavy-set and red-faced from drink, watched her too long. "That one," he muttered, "too quiet for her own good." He squinted as though silence itself could betray her. Yet there was nothing to grasp, her hands folded neatly, her head bowed in submission. He could not accuse without proof, and so he spat into the fire instead, dismissing the thought. Candlelight flickered unnaturally that night. Flames wavered though no wind stirred, shadows stretching long across the polished floors. Guests laughed louder to mask the unease, drinking deeper, their voices pitched against the hush that seemed to creep through the house whenever Caroline passed. The mistress, glowing in her silks, mistook Caroline's silence for obedience. She never saw the ember in her eyes, the calculation in her stillness. The feast pressed on, the hymns grew sweeter, but beneath it all, tension coiled like a noose tightening. Christmas morning was hours away. The fire waited, patient as Caroline herself. Christmas morning dawned with the sound of bells rolling across the Louisiana fields. The air carried frost, the ground hard beneath bare feet, yet the great house pulsed with warmth and music. Children tore ribbons from their gifts, squealing with delight as the mistress looked on, draped in silk and lace, jewels glittering in the pale winter light. Servants rushed with platters, cups, and kindling, their labor fueling the celebration of others. "Caroline," the mistress commanded, her voice sharp as a blade, "see that the fire is stoked. It must burn bright for the guests." Caroline bowed her head, her face unreadable. She moved to the parlor hearth where holly and pine garlands framed the mantel, their needles dry, brittle, waiting. From beneath her apron she drew the hidden pieces, cloth soaked in fat, splinters of resinous pine, a small ember cradled in clay. With practiced hands she laid them deep within the logs, careful, deliberate, as though she were merely tending the flame. But this was no tending, this was ignition. The fire leapt hungrily, faster than the eye could follow. Flames licked the garlands, caught the curtains, climbed the walls in ribbons of orange and gold. Guests screamed, their laughter turning to terror. The overseer rushed forward with a shout, but the blaze spread too fast, heat forcing him back. Smoke curled thick, swallowing the parlor in a choking veil. The mistress shrieked, her fine dress tangling her limbs as she stumbled. She clawed at the doorway, but the fire closed around her like a cage. Her jewels glinted one last time before they melted against her skin. Her screams tore through the house, echoing against the hymn-singing outside, twisting carols into a grotesque harmony with her agony. Through it all, Caroline stood still. She did not run. She did not shout. Her eyes reflected the flames, her face calm, unreadable, as though she had been waiting for this moment her entire life. Guests fled past her, blinded by smoke, never pausing to notice the silent woman who had become the fire's keeper. The parlor collapsed in sparks and ash. The mistress's voice faltered, then broke, swallowed by the roar of the inferno. Outside, bells tolled again, but now they sounded less like celebration and more like judgment. Caroline turned once toward the flames, her silence heavier than any cry, and walked into the smoke. When the fire finally choked itself to ash, nothing of the grand house remained but a blackened skeleton of stone and char. The white columns, once so proud, now stood cracked and scorched, jagged ribs of a body burned hollow. The Christmas feast lay untouched on the long table, its meats rotted, its fruit shriveled, its wine spilled and sticky along the floors that no longer existed. The bells that had rung so sweet that morning were silenced, their echoes drowned in smoke. Chaos spread like the fire itself. Overseers shouted, but their voices carried no weight. Fear had hollowed them out. Some of the enslaved fled into the swamps that same night, vanishing into cypress and shadow, never to return. Others lingered on the land, dazed, afraid, clinging to what scraps of life could be pulled from ruin. Yet among them one name pulsed unspoken: Caroline. No body was ever found. Some swore she had walked into the smoke and been swallowed whole, leaving nothing but embers where she stood. Others believed she had slipped away in the confusion, her silence carrying her beyond the reach of overseers and bloodhounds. Whether she lived or died, no one dared to ask aloud. Her absence was heavier than her presence had ever been. The mistress's death became a tale told in hushed tones, her screams replayed in every dream that haunted the survivors. Guests who fled that morning never returned, unwilling to set foot on cursed ground. The plantation's fields lay abandoned, cane shoots growing wild among the ashes. No master claimed it again. And still in the quarters, when the nights grew long and cold, whispers returned. The enslaved never spoke Caroline's name openly, but her memory lingered in silence, an ember carried from lip to lip, heart to heart. She had become both fear and hope, a ghost more powerful than any overseer's whip. The house was gone, the mistress consumed, but Caroline's silence endured, smoldering like coals beneath ash, never quenched, never forgotten. Decades passed, but the land where the plantation once stood never healed. The fields lay abandoned, overtaken by cane that grew wild and tangled. Moss crept thicker along the oaks, draping them in shrouds of gray. The grand house was gone, reduced to a ruin of scorched stone and shattered brick. Yet people still spoke of it, in taverns, in churchyards, along the dusty roads of Louisiana. They called it the Christmas Fire Plantation. Travelers said the place was cursed. Horses balked at its edge, refusing to step closer. Children whispered that on Christmas morning, if you dared stand near the ruins, you could hear a woman humming softly from the shadows. A lullaby, they said, sung in a voice both tender and broken, weaving through the smoke of memory. Some swore they had seen her, a figure of ash and ember, pacing slowly near the old quarters before vanishing like mist. Old folks told darker tales. They said a mirror salvaged from the parlor, cracked but still intact, sometimes betrayed a reflection not your own. Not your face, not your body, but that of a woman standing behind you, her hands cupped like bowls, holding fire that never consumed her. Many who saw it claimed they smashed the glass at once. Yet somehow the mirror always found its way back to the ruin. Others swore that each year, just as the bells began to toll on Christmas dawn, a faint charred cross reappeared upon the blackened hearthstone, fresh though no hand had carved it. Some took it as a mark of judgment, others as a sign of freedom bought at terrible cost. No one lingered long enough to decide. And every year, without fail, the air around the ruin grew heavy when the bells rang. The sound was never quite right, too thick, too sharp, as if the metal carried more than its own voice. Those who listened closely claimed they heard something else tangled within the peels, faint, agonized screams. Smoke sometimes rose from the earth itself, though no fire burned there. The Christmas fire plantation became a place avoided, feared, remembered only in whispers. Caroline's name was never spoken, yet her silence lived on, eternal. They said silence was obedience, but silence, when carried long enough, burns louder than any hymn. Do you feel Caroline's silence speaks for the voices of so many enslaved who were never heard? Her story is more than fire and vengeance. It is a reminder of survival, of dignity carried even in chains. If this story moved you, show your support. Like this video and subscribe to the channel so we can keep bringing these powerful stories of struggle, resilience, and legacy to light.